What's up everyone? In this video, I'll be diving into 8 unpopular cards in the 99 of my decks that have just been winning me games. Hopefully this will give you some ideas of new interactions or new cards to try out to break away from, that monotonous deck building style that EDH rec can sometimes cause over time. So with that being said, let's jump right in. The unpopular card being played in the most number of decks that I'll be covering today is Modify Memory with 9,578 decks. This card is hilarious, and I've won enough games with this that I've just started to include it in multiple blue decks now, not just specific commanders. Modify Memory is a 5-mana sorcery that says, exchange control of 2 target creatures controlled by different players. If you control neither creature, draw 3 cards. So there's kind of 2 scenarios for using this card, both of which can swing the momentum of a game for you. The first is using this card to switch out, a small creature token for the best creature on the battlefield. Instead of using a removal card on a creature, you now get to own it. I actually use this situation less frequently than the alternative, unless the creature itself poses a big enough threat to me or it plays well with my board. The reason I don't use this card as much as a steal spell is because if the creature is good enough, someone can just remove it, and I effectively just paid 5 mana for a removal spell. That's not to say I don't love exchanging creatures and haven't benefited so much from doing it, but what I am saying, however, is that I use this card to set back the 2 opponents who are doing the best in the game. It's no secret that people these days build decks so much around their commanders. I honestly think that's one of the biggest crutches of commander deck builders is many people rely on EDH rec that the cards they include are all synergistic of the commander. So if the commander is removed from the game even 1 or 2 times, it's usually GG. I honestly own a few of these decks that's so centric on the commander that if it's gone, then there's really not much of a way that I'm winning. I've played this card enough now, and I've seen how much of an impact it has when I switch out 2 commanders that it usually just devastates people and gives me enough of a lead that I can capitalize it on and win. So the reason why I include this is I usually switch out the 2 commanders of the players that are the most ahead, and then they usually have to spend their next 1 or 2 turns trying to remove their commander and then cast it again. And by that time, their game plan has just slowed down, and I drew 3 from the card. And 5 mana to draw 3 isn't terrible, but it's a good effect for how big of an impact it has on my opponents. I actually played a game recently where the Smeagol Helpful Guide player was running away with the game pretty early. So I switched out it with Joyra Weatherlight Captain. Both spent their next 2 turns swinging their commanders at each other and killing them, and the momentum was killed and let me win the game not long after. In most cases, this is better than kind of like a 2-for-1 commander removal because the commanders don't work well with the other player's decks, so they need to waste their own removal to get it back. We're moving to white next with Mandate of Peace, which sees play in 8,666 decks. This card is bonkers. It is a 2-mana instant that says, cast this spell only during combat. Your opponents can't cast spells this turn. End the combat phase. And in parentheses, it says, remove all attackers and blockers from combat. Exile all spells and abilities from the stack, including this spell. This card can do a few things. 1, you can use it on your turn if an opponent casts a combat trick or removal spell on one of your attacking creatures. This will end the combat phase and exile the removal spell from the stack. You can also use it as a combo protection piece, so kind of like a silence. You attack, then cast a spell. In your second main phase, you can now cast your combo, and your opponents can no longer cast any spells to interact with the combo pieces. You can also use this on your opponent's turn to fog your opponent's attack, counter any attack triggers like from Ishin or Atali, or shut off their entire plans for the second half of their turn, because they can no longer cast spells in their second main phase. People may not use this as much in CEDH, but so many casual commander decks these days still focus on winning through combat, so they never see a fog coming, especially from a non-green deck. You choose if you want to use it as a fog, a silence, a combo protection piece, or discontinuity to counter attack triggers and combat spells. It's a fun card that can be very versatile, so give it a shot if you haven't ever seen or used this card before. Plunge into Darkness is the next unpopular card that sees play in only 5,814 decks. Plunge into Darkness costs 1 and a black and says, choose one. Sacrifice any number of creatures, then you gain 3 life for each sacrificed creature. Or pay X life. Then look at the top X cards of your library, put one of those cards into your hand, and remove the rest from the game. You can also pay 1 additional black to choose both options. I love this card for a few reasons. One is that it allows me to sacrifice any number of creatures to capitalize on death triggers or aristocrat cards that I have on the field when I can't draw into one of my unlimited sacrifice outlets. I use this primarily as a cheap sacrifice outlet, but the life gain is a huge benefit. For example, I might have 10 tokens lying around in my Elasil core deck, but I don't have a Phyrexian Altar, an Ashnod's Altar, or a Viscera Seer on the battlefield to capitalize on my Zulaport Cutthroat. If I draw Plunge into Darkness, I can now sacrifice any number of creatures that I want. So for the sake of this example, let's say I sacrifice 10 creatures and gain 30 life. With the Entwine cost, I can now pick any amount of life to look at the top X cards of my deck and pick one. So in this, let's say I sacrifice 10 creatures, drain my opponents with Zulaport and Elasil Core, gain 30 life for Plunge into Darkness, and 10 more from Zulaport. Then I pay 15 life to look at the top 15 cards of my deck and select the best card or win con that I need, all for 3 mana. I will say one of the main reasons why I think this card might not see as much play is because it removes all unselected cards from the game rather than putting it on the bottom of your library or into your graveyard. However, I don't mind because I will never play all 100 cards in my deck. I will likely see 25 to 50 cards in my deck depending on the length of the game, but this card lets me increase that to maybe 70 or 80% of my deck, and I can pick the best one for me at that point in the game. You don't even need to use, how I said, maybe you want to use it on turn 2 to pay 5 life and get a land so you don't miss a land drop. It's very versatile also, and it's a cheap card that lets me gain life or use it as my life as a resource, and it always has a use case when I draw it. This next card can absolutely devastate decks like Atraxa, the Ur-Dragon, and so many more of the most popular commanders on the top 200 commander list. And that's Wave of Vitriol, which is in 5,312 decks. It is a high CMC spell, 7 costing, but if it resolves, it can be hilarious for unprepared decks. It says, each player sacrifices all artifacts, enchantments, and non-basic lands he or she controls. For each land sacrificed this way, its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then each player who searched his or her library this way shuffles it. Okay, so this card does a few things. Number 1, it makes people sacrifice all artifacts. So this includes indestructible artifacts, treasures, clues, blood tokens, and mana rocks. Number 2, people sacrifice all their enchantments, so it messes with Enchantress decks and gets around targeting. Number 3, which is the reason why I play it, is everyone, including you, sacrifices all non-basic lands, then replaces it with basic lands. From what I've seen, most 5-color, 4-color, and even 3-color decks these days don't play enough basic lands. When I discovered this card, I went to Reddit to see if it was considered taboo land destruction because I tend to avoid those types of things, but the general consensus is that people are fine with this card because it replaces the lands that are sacrificed and it mostly punishes greedy deck building. Any dual land, triome, fast land, shock land, surveil land, etc. gets sacrificed, and you'd be surprised at how many people don't have enough basic lands in their deck to replace all the non-basic lands that were sacrificed. I include this card in my Emoti deck, so I usually cascade into it, and as an Emoti player, I play mostly land ramp cards, so I have 36 basic lands that I can fetch. This also plays really well in green creature strategies that don't depend on enchantments and artifacts. So if you're sick of losing to 5 mana, 4 mana commanders, try this card out and let me know how it goes. I'd love to hear if you're able to resolve it and what the effect was. I've said in my last 2 videos that this past year I kind of went through an is it phase, and this next card is one of my favorites because it has never not had an impact for me. and that's Howl of the Horde, which is in 4,509 decks. Howl of the Horde costs 2 generic and a red that says, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. It also has a raid ability, which says, if you attacked with a creature this turn, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell an additional time. You may choose new targets for the copy. So right off the bat, I will say that I never cast this card unless I have the raid ability, which is very easy to achieve because there's usually a token laying around, whether that was created from something like Young Pyromancer or a small early game creature that I no longer have use for. For 3 mana, copying it once is not efficient, but copying a spell twice for 3 mana is a great rate. To receive that same benefit, Repeated Reverberation costs 4 mana, but is in 3 times as many decks. Storm King's Thunder and Increasing Vengeance would cost 5 mana for 2 copies, as opposed to the 3 mana from Howl of the Horde. Aside from being less CMC than these options, the other reason why I play Howl of the Horde over Repeated Reverberation is because it has 1 red pip as opposed to 2. This means I can usually get that down to just 1 mana with cards like Case of the Ransacked Lab, Brawl Chief of Compliance, Goblin Electromancer, Stormcatch Mentor, Primal Amulet, or things like Mind Splice Apparatus. Use this to cast 3 copies of Crackle with Power or 3 copies of the Big Score, and if you do that, you only need to pay the additional cost once. So for 7 mana, you would discard 1 card, draw 6 cards, and create 6 treasure tokens. If you're looking for a good copy spell, I've tried them all, and this is one of my favorites. Let me know what you think. Give it a shot, and if you already do use this card, please let me know how you like it. Gold Rush is next, which sees play in 4,464 decks. Now, I will say right off the bat, this card doesn't apply to every deck, but you don't need to be playing a treasure deck to have this card do surprising work. Many non-treasure themed decks can still accumulate 4 to 5 treasures, but if you are playing a dedicated treasure deck, it can kill an opponent out of nowhere after no blocks are declared. This card costs 1 and a green and says, create a treasure token. Until end of turn, up to 1 target creature gets +2/+2 for each treasure you control. So first of all, it pays back half of its cost by creating a treasure token for the cost of 2 mana. I play this card in my Jolene the Plunder Queen deck, who makes this a free spell essentially by creating 2 treasures instead of 1. I usually have over 10 treasure tokens at any given moment with Jolene, so if I swing with a 2/2 and she goes unblocked, I can usually kill someone in 1 shot out of nowhere with this card. But with that, if it was only 1 treasure and gave that +2/+2, I wouldn't include this in any of my decks. The reason why I keep coming back to it is because I've never used it for just +2/+2. It's usually giving double-digit strength at instant speed. I think it's the only card that I have used to get +30/+30 for only 2 mana. So Agnes players out there, give it a try. The last thing I will say is I tried not to include many cards on this list that are theme specific, but treasures are the second most popular theme with almost 200,000 decks, so this may fit in more decks than you would think. Also, if you have a multicolor deck that uses Zada, use this for Zada, and it's a perfect thing to overwhelm your opponents and create a ton of treasures. Coming down to our last 2, Fleeting Reflection has 3,005 total decks. Fleeting Reflection is an instant that costs 1 and a blue, and it says, target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn. Untap that creature. Until end of turn, it becomes a copy of up to 1 other target creature. So let's break it down. There's several things that this card does, all of which have different use cases, and that's why I include it in multiple of my decks. Benefit number 1 is that this card gives a creature hexproof until end of turn. This can protect your best creature or important piece on the board, which is always super valuable. However, the mode doesn't come up as often because I mostly play unpopular commanders that tend to go under the radar anyways. The second benefit is that it untaps your creature at instant speed. I've actually used this mode so many times when my creatures are tapped out and someone swings at me. I can't tell you how many commanders I've killed that thought they had a free swing on me, and I copied a bigger creature and killed it. And I mean, they can't even get mad at me about it because they were targeting me. They swung at me. The last benefit, however, is the one that has actually won me the most games. and that's becoming a copy of the best creature on the board until end of turn. So when you see this card, it's easy to think, oh, can you imagine copying a Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, and swinging with Annihilator 4? That likely won't ever happen, though. And my personal experience is game-changing effects like that happen way more than you think. It might not be Annihilator 4, and in that case, it only sets back one opponent, but people play some busted creatures in Commander. You can copy it before declaring attackers to get awesome attack triggers, or very often you can get through with a 1/1 flying token after no blocks are declared and copy, let's say, a 12/12 Galta to deal 11 more damage than their calculations and kill them. I mean, 12/12 is an extreme example, but even 6 more damage than expected can oftentimes do the trick. People never see this card coming when I use it for any of the 3 purpose, and it's never a dead card in my hand. I absolutely love it. For the last card on the list, we're moving all the way down to 2,194 decks with Illicit Masquerade from Murders at Karlov Manor. This is a 4-mana enchantment with flash that says, when Illicit Masquerade enters the battlefield, put an imposter counter on each creature you control. Whenever a creature you control with an imposter counter on it dies, exile it. Return up to one other target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. This card can do work in decks, and in more decks than people give it credit for. There are 3 reasons why this card to me is just crazy. Number 1, the creature just comes back, period. They don't enter with a finality counter, so when they die, they get exiled. No, they just go back to the graveyard. Number 2, there is not a clause on it that says once each turn. So you can keep repeating it. You can do this multiple times in a single turn. And 3, there's no if you do clause attached to it. So this one is actually really important. And what I mean is it doesn't say whenever a creature you control with an imposter counter on it dies, exile it. If you do, return up to one other target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, without this clause, you can stack the triggers to only ever lose one creature to a board wipe. So let's say you have a Valgavoth in the graveyard, and on the battlefield you have a Shieldred the Apocalypse, a 1/1 vampire token, and a Grey Merchant of Asphodel on the board. Someone plays a board wipe, and in response you cast this at instant speed. All creatures die, then there are 3 individual triggers that hit the stack at the same time. Since they're simultaneous, you can stack them so your worst creature, which is the token, would resolve at the top of the stack. The token triggers first, so we exile the token to bring back Shieldred the Apocalypse. The ability resolves, so Shieldred now enters the battlefield. Shieldred's trigger then resolves, but it can't exile it because it's a new game item that is no longer in the graveyard. But you can still revive a creature because the card does not have an if you do clause. So we revive Gary, and when the trigger resolves, Gary enters the battlefield and drains your opponents. Gary's illicit masquerade effect now triggers, but once again, Gary is a new game item that is not in the graveyard. So you don't exile Gary, but the trigger still resolves because it's on the stack, and you can now bring back Valgavoth from the graveyard. So this card can be used as a keep all of your creatures but one in response to a board wipe. This example shows that, all of that, what happens when all of them die at once. But the other example shows how it can be used without a board wipe. So let's say you have 6 tokens on the battlefield when you cast Illicit Masquerade. You then cast Gary, who doesn't have an imposter counter on him. You can sacrifice Gary, and he goes to the graveyard. You then sacrifice one of the tokens to bring back Gary, whose drain ability resolves again. Since you have, let's say, an unlimited sacrifice outlet, you can now sacrifice Gary, and since he wasn't brought back from the graveyard with a finality counter, he goes back to the graveyard, and this process can be repeated 5 more times, or however many times that you have, 10 or 15 tokens on the battlefield. So this card is wildly slept on, and I just can't believe that it's in only 2,000 decks. Every time I cast it, it has done incredible work, especially if you have a token theme, because you don't feel bad about exiling your tokens when they die. Well, that's all I have today. I feel like I could go on and on about my favorite cards and unpopular cards that I use, but I'll keep that here for today. I'd love to hear what you think of the video, and if you enjoy hearing about unpopular cards in the 99 as well. I appreciate you all. I love reading your comments, hearing about the decks you're building, cards you like to use. So thank you all for being here and in the Unpopular MTG community, and I'll see you next time.